Today, we're going to get into something that almost no one has gone over in their tutorials, the correct way to format your code for Roblox and Lua. This isn't going to be a matter of opinion, it's actually coming from Roblox themselves and based on what's called in the coding world a style guide. Stay tuned and we'll walk through where you can find the style guide and do some examples to show you how and why we want to do this. Let's be honest with ourselves, coders are lazy. We want to do what we can to make typing out our code as simple as fast as possible. Unfortunately, that ends up being detrimental to anyone else that has to read our code later on for any reason, including ourselves. Have you ever made a decently complex script and come back to look at it or make changes to it quite a while later down the road only to be completely lost on how the heck you made things work in the first place? Or maybe you eventually figure it out, but only after spending too long reading each line of your code to figure out what it does. Or maybe you got a script from someone else in the community that does a thing sort of how you want, but you need to make changes to it in order for it to work in your experience. And when you go to look over the script or scripts involved, you end up with no idea how the heck to make any of those necessary changes without, again, spending a significant amount of time trying to figure things out. Or even worse, you're working on a game that you've been commissioned for or whatever, and previous commissioned scripters have written code that you need to either tie into in some way or at the very least understand how it works, and all they've left you with is uncommented, shorthand, non-meaningful variable and function names or just terribly written and organized code. The thing is, working code does not automatically mean that it's good code. In fact, more often than not, it's less efficient code if not written properly due to being unable to easily see where optimizations can be made or updates to new technology that come online can be implemented or bug fixes, all sorts of different things. That's where style guides come in. And a coding style guide is typically made for each programming language out there. Its primary purpose is to provide consistency with code that's more readable and easier to maintain and review. When scripts adhere to the same style, it becomes way easier to spot issues, errors, and bugs during code reviews. It should ultimately allow anyone looking at multiple scripts written by multiple developers to believe that they were all written by a single developer or a single team at least. A cohesive team, right? Another benefit of style guides is enforcement. It removes guesswork and ambiguities in code, which, there's clear rules for indentation, naming conventions, and even comments. So by following a style guide, you can focus on solving problems rather than worrying about how to format your code. Now, these guides are designed to promote industry-wide efficiency by using industry-proven coding practices that even I find myself leaning away from time to time, but are more than worth adhering to. So when everyone follows the same conventions, collaboration becomes way smoother and maintaining your code becomes less error-prone. Even if you don't adopt every specific thing in a style guide exactly as written, as long as the entire team is adhering to the same practices and writing style, you can achieve a similar result. So lastly, going back to how hard it can be to figure out what someone else's code or even your own code from a while back is doing, style guides improve readability. It's proper use of white space such as indentations, line breaks, etc. This makes code more readable. Whether you prefer compact styles or more spaced out ones, the key is to consistently leverage white space to make the code easy to understand. So for example, let me just give a couple examples here. So this is actually pulled from a project I'm working on for someone else, and they had somebody else come in the script. I'm not going to give names or projects or anything like that, but essentially, like they're using RS here for replicated storage, and they also have run service. If you notice, run service also has the abbreviation of RS that they could use. So further down the code, if we're saying RS, if I'm not able to see that for whatever reason, I have to sit there and guess, wait, is RS run service or is it replicated storage? Now it turns out, because I take every code that I'm reviewing and I place it into VS Code immediately, the way that I have my linter going here, it will point out a lot of different errors for me and stuff. There's no errors in this specific script here, but what you can see is that run service is an unused variable, tween service is an unused variable. This whole variables table, which is spelled incorrectly by the way, is an unused thing as well. So honestly, like, you could really just, oh, players is unused now because of that. So really we're just using this and we should just call this replicated storage, right? And because I'm in VS Code, I can even hit F2 and I can call the whole thing replicated storage, and it will change every instance of that tag for me. So that's kind of nice. There's also these empty blank spaces here, which aren't really that big a deal. That's something that Roblox Studio basically doesn't, when you hit enter and you create a new line, it'll insert these automatically. However, another nice thing being in here is I can just save this file, Control S to save, and it will apply a style guide here for it because I have Stylua installed, and this is an automatic code formatter to adhere mostly to the style guide where it can, obviously. So like there's not a space between our parameters here, for example, as well, and we have all these spaces here. So if I Control S, you'll see that it actually fixes a lot of things and includes a lot of the style stuff. But even just looking at this code, like we are creating an unpack table. We're unpacking all of the optional, however many arguments we're feeding into this this connected function for this FX bridge. By the way, this script's name was replication/VFX, which is a terrible name. Like, why put a slash in the name? I couldn't do that. Like when I copied it over here, I couldn't even do that, because what that does when you do that is creates a new directory, a folder called replication, and places VFX as the script inside of it. So that's a whole nother thing. But I mean, just kind of looking at this here, so another thing I noticed is like they have this character variable. It turns out, as I did a lot of research on this, that this character variable could be a vector3, it could be a C-frame, it could be a model, which would be an actual character in the case that they're using it in here, or it could be a base part. So calling it character doesn't really make sense, and the fact is I had to really go through the code and try to figure that out, because there's also no type annotation or anything in here telling me what it is, right? Not to mention, like, what is effect, right? What are we expecting? What kind of type of data are we expecting effect to be, so I can actually know that here. There's no comments whatsoever in this, and I can even go ahead and go over to another one. This one's dodge run management. So this one, at least they're doing these quite well, right? As far as they're using more verbose naming conventions for things. However, it is something, there's no white space here separating these, right? And on top of that, they're really overusing the find first child in this. Mind you, this is a server script. So telling it to find first child events and then find first child player. The fact is if this is nil and then this is nil and then this is nil, like that can actually return an error as well. So you don't really want to do that. And then you're not even checking, like the whole reason you would use find first child is that this could possibly come back as nil. If this comes back as nil, you want to stop running the code. This won't do that. These will just all be set to nil, and then as soon as you get to detection component.onServerInvoke, you're going to be like, okay, well, this is nil, so nil.onServerInvoke doesn't do anything, so there's no error checking in here, which would be the only reason you really need to use find first child, right? On top of that, like we have these either bindable, well, these aren't bindable functions, these would be remote functions, and we don't know what they're doing. We have no idea what the hell these are actually doing. In fact, this one's even passing in another remote function as an argument. It's like, what the hell is going on? I could not figure out what this was actually doing in the short time that I was looking things over, but that is what it is. And then we have this one here. It was just named script. That's also bad. We have our replicated storage. We have an action event, which is an action remote event, which I would have to look into. Now, typically when I'm doing things, because in VS Code, I don't put events in my actual stuff here, so I would actually call this a remote, or, tell it that this is a remote event. On top of, why I would do that on top of just my own sanity is that if I say action event here and I do like dot, it's not going to give me anything because it doesn't actually know what it is. Versus if I tell it that this is a remote event. Now when I hit dot, I'm going to have all the stuff that remote events have, including the on client or server event, whichever it happens to be. Now of course it's not going to necessarily determine that this is a server script, and it should only give me the on server event, but I should obviously know whether this is going to be server side or not, based on what kind of script it is or where I'm going to be using it. But either way, so they are at least saying that this is a player. Actually, I think I might have I might have filled this one in, to be honest with you. But it doesn't really matter. And then they're just unpacking all these things again, and they're saying unpack.timed, unpack.attribute, unpack.value. So where are these coming from? Not only that, but what kind of values are these supposed to be? Like, it's very unclear what was really going on here. One final one I'll go over. So they're using services as a table here, and they're creating all of these get service values, and they're storing all these things. Now, of course, each of these variables is taking up some bit of memory. It's going to be very small, but it is taking up some bit of memory. And guess how many of these they're actually using. So here's the thing, VS Code can't determine which of these are unused because it is packed into a table, so it doesn't really know that these are just table values. Fact is, they're only using, I think, replicated storage, which we can see there, and I can even do a Control F to see. So as long as it's more than 2, because we obviously have replicated storage as the variable name, and then we have replicated storage as the thing that it's getting, right, the service that it's getting. If I do server storage, that one's not being used, right? It's only got these two right here. Lighting, that one's not being used. Players, that one's not being used. HTTP service is not being used, and so on, right? So you can go through and see, I think, again, tween service is the only other one that's being used, yeah. So why even bother getting all these? Not to mention, in order to then get access to replicated storage, you have to type out services.replicated storage, as opposed to simply just having a replicated storage up at the top. And the thing about these, more verbose names as opposed to just typing RS, here's the thing. If I, for example, have replicated storage here up at the top, we'll just do local replicated storage like that. So I've had to type that once, right? Yes. But now if I come down here and I type REP, right? You can even see it when I just typed RE, it's right there, right? I can just get replicated storage. Autocomplete's going to help a lot with this. So you don't really have to type more than 2 letters in that case to do that. Even if it's, just you start doing it like this. I don't know why this has been doing this for a while now. Repeat until is coming up first on my autocomplete when I do replicated storage. It's really annoying because obviously, like, why wouldn't you give me the 2 things that actually have those letters connected to each other? I don't know. Anyways, that's a side thing. But other than that, that is another thing actually to point out too. If you're doing this in VS Code, right? If you're doing this using Rojo kind of setup, and you've got your Lua language server and whatnot, a nice thing is like I can say replicated first, and it knows that replicated first isn't automatically gotten anywhere. But it will automatically get the service replicated first, and it will place it up here. And the beauty is it'll automatically put it in alphabetical order, which we'll go over here in a little bit. So let's get back to kind of what we're talking about. So let's go up to our browser here. So of course, Roblox scripting is based on a language called Lua, as I mentioned. They've of course done quite a bit of tinkering additions to Lua and actually called their version Luau. There exists this style guide for there exists a style guide for Lua, but Roblox themselves have also created their own style guide for Luau, and you can find a link to this in the description below. Otherwise, it's roblox.github.io/lua-style-guide, or honestly, you can just Google search Roblox Style Guide, and it will pull up. It'll be the very first thing that pulls up there. Before we look over the guide itself, let's first take a peek at the official luau.org website. So this is, you can find a ton of information from the people that actively work on Luau and how it's designed to be used. So this isn't the same as the Roblox documentation, which includes all of the additional Roblox stuff itself. This is strictly just like the Luau coding language stuff itself here. And for example, we can look at, if we scroll down here, the syntax section. And this goes into detail about how to properly write Luau code to make it work as intended, and even has some overlap between here and the style guide we're going to cover in a moment. I highly suggest, if you're serious about getting better at coding and have a basic understanding thus far, come here and look over a few things. Reading documentation is really the best way to start to understand how code works, how you should write code, what you can do with code. There's a lot of things you can learn that, about services and things that you may be using constantly every day as you're scripting, that you didn't realize, oh, there's this additional method, or there's this additional property that I can access that I didn't realize existed. and you can do a whole lot of things, and it can create a lot of really cool situations where you didn't realize that you could make something easier in your scripting, or make something better and more optimized, that sort of stuff. So I really highly recommend that you come in and kind of look at these sorts of things, including the Roblox documentation. That one's huge, right? That one's got a lot of the Roblox specific stuff if you're coding for Roblox. It's a lot like looking into that, but on a side note, you can also run Lua code from in here. They have this demo, and this is an online IDE. And this specifically is tied into Luau, so as opposed to, if you go to Lua's official website, they also have one of these, but it's only obviously for Lua, and this one actually includes a lot of the additional stuff that Luau has added to it, that the writers of Luau have added to it. Obviously it's not going to have the Roblox specific stuff, this is strictly just Luau code. But the cool thing is you can actually, if you have anything that's not relying specifically on like referencing a part or, you know, some other script or anything like that, you can actually test out like functions and different things like that and run them and actually see the output here without even having to open Roblox Studio, which is kind of cool. So there's also even getting started section here, which you can use to get Luau actually running on your local system using an IDE like Visual Studio Code, for example. Last thing I'll mention about luau.org is their section on profiling. This is really cool if you want to get into the weeds about how well or not your code is performing. This actually uses Python to create this awesome little graph here, a little flame graph. So if you really want to get into that, you can. So while syntax, like I showed you here, is how you write correct code, the style guide is how you format your code. So we'll go ahead and go back to this now. So you can see here this is actually based on Google C++ style guide. A lot of companies like Google and Microsoft, to name a couple, have made their own style guides that many devs adhere to. Microsoft themselves were behind the creation of C#, for example, and their style guide for it is basically the go-to for that language. Right? Python and JavaScript also have their own official style guides, as do like Go and Rust, and I mean, you can keep going, you know. They all have their official guides, and those are the ones that people tend to lean towards. So once you go over one style guide, much like coding languages themselves, you'll find a lot of similarities between the different style guides for those languages. Again, these are industry-proven practices. I'll mention as well, there are a couple of user-made Roblox style guides out there that you can find like on the dev forums. Some of them even claim to be based on this official guide, but that literally defeats the point because they then change things. They do things differently. Now again, that's good if you have like a whole team that is doing the same thing, that's fine, as long as you're all doing the same thing. Although they are kind of going against some of the more efficient and optimized practices that this guide goes over. I've looked them over, they're really not great. So, you know, the guide exists to have everyone write code as similarly to each other as possible, and I really don't recommend following any non-official guides for that very reason. So let's go ahead and take a look at the guide itself. So they do have these guiding principles. This essentially talks about like why this exists, right? And the main thing, this is something that I really try to drive home as much as possible when I'm talking to other people about, you know, learning to code and stuff. Optimize your code for reading, not writing, right? You will write your code once, right? You might refactor it, but ideally you're gonna write it once. Many people will need to read it, from reviewers like myself a lot of times, to anyone else that touches the code. As I mentioned, you know, going in and having to tie into somebody else's script, like if they've worked on a combat system and you're designing a system that ties into that directly, and you have to know, you know, like how hitboxes work, or, you know, anything like that. Being able to understand how that works quickly and easily is so useful. It's so beneficial. It saves so much time. It prevents tech debt as well. Tech debt, if you're unaware, the definition here. So technical debt is the cost of making shortcuts in coding to meet deadlines or simplify tasks, right? It leads to future maintenance and development challenges. Often it's going to cost you a lot of time on the back end when you have to go through and refactor things to be a lot better and more efficient and optimized and fix bugs and things like that. So yeah, short term, great, it's up and working, right? Again, working code is not necessarily good code. It does not equal the same thing. Also, of course, if you yourself are going back to something in like 6 months, who remembers exactly how they wrote a code 6 months ago, especially if there's no comments, there's no, you know, information whatsoever. It's poorly written. You've used shorthand variable names. Your function names are really terrible. who's going to understand, you know, their own code that much later on? So all else being equal, consider what diffs look like. So for this, I'll actually show you. Now, you can do diffs in Roblox Studio as well, but we'll pull up one here. So I'll pull up source control in here, and we can kind of see. We'll do this, for example. So a diff, essentially, you would have a side-by-side, and you can see what's been changed in a file. I typically do them all on one side, but you can do a side-by-side comparison where you have a split screen, essentially, and that's how Roblox Studio does it as well, where you can see like what's been changed or removed, what's been added, and you can go through and see, you know, even specific lines and things. A lot of this looks the same, but you know, so certain little changes like this, and it's a lot easier to see those changes when you are adhering to the similar style, right? So that's kind of the point of that. All right, so back up to our browser. Avoiding magic. So magic code is things that, like, so for example, meta tables offer meta methods. I'm going to be doing a video going over meta tables when we do OOP, since it uses it so much. But these create meta methods that you can use to override the functionality, for example, like the plus. Right, when you use addition on something, you can actually override that, or toString or anything like that, and that can cause a lot of issues. That it's powerful, but yeah, it is here. No one knows why it broke or how to fix it. You know, it's hard to know when something goes wrong using those sorts of magical code where it just exists in the background. You can't really tell. So otherwise, file structure is a big deal. So this is kind of where you'll notice I've gone over in my videos, that you have specific things in specific places in your actual script. So an optional block comment talking about why the file exists, right? Don't attach a file name, author, or date. These are things that version control should be able to tell us. If I'm doing something specifically in my own world and then I import it into somebody else's, it doesn't necessarily tie a lot of this information into it in Roblox Studio. Now, if everybody's working in GitHub or something like that, where all of that's going to be handled with that version control system, then it's great. You do have some viewing of that in Roblox Studio. It's just not exactly as well, but it is there. And you can actually see an example of this if I go into my random selection that I just did recently. I have this optional block comment up here, right? So that just kind of tells you what it does. Next thing is services. So you want to get all your services, obviously using get service, and have them all right at the top. The reason you want to do that is that way any services that you need to access throughout the code are going to be available for you. There is one exception to this that I've ever done, and that is in a loading screen script that you have in replicated first, where typically you want to get like replicated first service, obviously, to get all the stuff that you need, the loading screen itself. But then you might need to get services for other things, where, further down the line, once you've, removed the initial loading screen, all that kind of stuff, then you get those services later on. So that's kind of the one exception to that, that I've found anyways. And then you've got your module imports, so any of your require modules. You want to have those there. Any module level constants, module level variables and functions, you want to have all those up there. Any objects that the module returns, if you've got any of that stuff that you need to use in there, you want to have those all up towards the top there. And then of course your return statement, you want to have that there as well. So it goes into details over requires. I'm not going to go into super line by line on this. I want you guys to go through and read this yourself as well, but basically make all your require calls at the top of the file so that all your dependencies are static. That way, again, if you ever require in the middle of your file and you go in later on and you put something above that actually requires that module, then you're gonna have to move things anyway, so just do it right the first time. They should be sorted alphabetically by module name. Same thing with the services. It's good to have those alphabetical, and you saw that the VS Code is actually doing that. My LSP was doing that, or my Stylua, whichever was doing that. Automatically it was put in alphabetical order. For the require structure, basically you want a definition of a common ancestor. So if the modules, if you're getting multiple modules and they exist in the same folder, you want to go ahead and basically get a variable definition reference for the folder, and then you can go in and get a block that is importing all your different packages. If you're doing libraries and stuff, which I go over libraries, I touch on them a bit anyways in my module script video, I believe. And libraries basically typically are going to be a module script with a bunch of children module scripts. So in this case, like foobar is a folder inside of my project. We're using my class in this case. And there's a couple of modules here, and then baz.lua is going to be a package, you know, a library, and this has its children here. So the way that they're doing it, and this obviously looks messy because there's a lot of comments in here. Don't over comment, right? This is obviously for demonstration purposes, but don't over comment because obviously then it makes it less readable as well. But so we're getting my project as the overall folder, which is, this is in our my class, so we can just use script.parent for that. And then get a block of all of your imported packages. In this case, baz is the imported package itself. And then we have a block for any definitions derived from the package. Nice thing is typically you can access, if these, you know, if bazifier and unbazifier are actually implemented in baz in the main package script, you can, or main library script, you can actually just access baz and still get functionality from either of these if you need to, but this is also a good way to do it. And then a block of modules imported from the same project, so yeah, just doing that. So meta tables, this is a big one, and again, I'll go over this in OOP more clearly because we are talking about prototype-based classes. So Lua doesn't do classes in the general sense that a lot of other coding languages do, especially like C++, which is C with classes, right? C plus classes, that's where C++ comes from. But you use tables, and tables are very powerful in Lua. It's kind of how they do everything, honestly, and using meta methods and things, or meta tables, that's how you can create an actual class system, an OOP system. And they go over basically how to do a lot of this stuff, including creating your type here. Now this is where there's two different ways to do this. I'm actually going to open up luau.org again because I want to show off here. If we go to syntax and I go to string literal, oh no, it's in the type checking, of course. So yeah, here, type checking. So if we go down to, here we are, adding types for faux object-oriented programs. So there's a whole way that they do it here. So this is kind of the default way, and they talk about how, you know, self doesn't know what it is because you haven't actually typed out what an account is or anything like that. And then they give you a different example here. So we have an account implementation, which goes over everything that's actually in the account class itself. And then the type account, this would be what you would export if you were gonna then set something to an account type. And they go over and set the meta table and all that kind of stuff. So this is one way to do it. And then they go into the way that they have it here, where they're just doing this class type directly as a meta table in the my class and all that kind of stuff. So you can do it either way. I have my random selection script actually done the way that is in the style guide, and then I have other ones that are actually using this method. Honestly, I think I kind of prefer this method. It's just a little more verbose and looks a little messier at the top of the script, but what this does and what this does is basically you are not only you know, stating what is in the class type here, but you're doing it while you're doing the actual functions and whatnot themselves. The reason you're doing it doubly, and they even mention here, is basically our strict type inference introduces redundancy because you're doing it twice, but warnings will be flagged if two definitions fall out of sync with each other, and that's really useful as you're creating things. Not to mention, again, if you're calling self, it knows what self is, it knows what it includes, no matter where you are, you know, in further functions like add one, right? So it's going to autofill a lot easier, which makes the whole script a lot easier to write once you've done the type annotation here. But aside from that, so guarding against typos is another great way to use meta methods. So you can use the dunder index. I say dunder, it's not the way it's usually said in Luau or Lua, but I come in from Python, you might be familiar with dunder. So dunder just means double underscore. Now in Python, it's double underscore index double underscore would be what that would be, but and I still call it dunder just because it's easier to say dunder than underscore underscore. So Dunder index meta method. So in this case, they've got an enum that they're creating a B, B, C, C. And then they're basically indexing as if if they go ahead and say, try to call an index that doesn't exist in the table, we are indexing to say, oh, it's gonna actually, give you an error, and you can create all that and all that kind of stuff. So it's great for that. There's a really great usage of enums. I'll probably do a video on that, creating your own enums to prevent typos specifically, that you can use, where you can set up like all of your remote event names and things like that. Anything that you're requiring, you can set it as an enum so that when you go to type it out, you're using essentially a table that has these values saved, so it'll auto-complete a lot easier. You don't have to worry about typos. Anyways, genuine punctuation. Don't use semicolons. Just straight up, it just says don't use them. Yes, you can use them. They're completely optional, I guess. And if you want to put multiple statements on a single line, I guess you could, but you shouldn't be putting multiple statements on a single line anyways, as I said right here. Again, it just says don't use them. So, if you're used to using them from other programming languages, just get used to not using them in here. They're not good. General white space. So this is talking about indentation. It's saying indent with tabs, not with spaces. And this is a big deal here too. And you'll see when I have my my stuff open here, like if I go ahead and zoom out, so you can see with these two ruler lines, and I even have this set up in Roblox Studio as well. So this is at 80 columns. If you're unfamiliar with columns, it's basically how many characters, right, how many spaces all the way over to this area. And you can even see when you're in here that this is column 81 because, it's 81. This is the 80th column, and then we are on column 81 with our cursor line here. And then this is to column 100. So what it's saying in the style guide is to keep your code lines under 100 columns wide, assuming you're 4 column wide tabs. So typically a tab, when you hit tab on your keyboard, is going to be 4 spaces, right? 4 columns. And then, Lua check is another thing that you can use, and it's saying it's not accurate with tab characters, so favor using Stylua instead. Stylua is fantastic. What I use, wrap comments to an 80 columns wide situation here, again assuming the 4 column wide tabs. This is different than normal code. The hope is that short lines help improve readability of common prose. But the biggest thing is that like if you are reading comments or code on multiple different resolutions of screens, that it's going to be visible, like your code is going to be visible and things are going to be visible more often than not. Now you might have noticed that in certain cases I do go over the stuff. Now this is mostly in things that don't tend to matter, like my type stuff, but you'll see like this, typically I would not have done it like this. I would have actually broken this out. I don't know if Stylua is not gonna. Sometimes Stylua actually places things ways that I don't want to do, so down here it just made some changes to the way that it broke things out here. Yeah, so I'm not really sure what it did down there, but we can look into that another time. Anyways, so don't leave white space at the end of lines, which is if you, for example, down here, if I leave a space and I go somewhere else, you'll see that this even shows me that there's a space there. And if I Control S to save this, Stylua is going to even remove that for me. Let me go ahead and zoom this back in to make it a little easier to see. So again, a space there, and you can see it has that there. So also add a new line at the end of the file. So this is completely unnecessary with a lot of interpreters. Modern interpreters do not necessarily care about that, but that is something that interpreters and compilers in particular, they tend to like an empty line at the end of the file, at the end of the script, so that it knows where the end of the file actually is. It just helps with certain things, but again, it's not 100% necessary. Again, if you use Stylua or anything like that, it's going to automatically end that with an empty line. No vertical alignment. So this is something that I see a lot less frequently, thankfully, but I do see it every now and then. So yeah, it makes code difficult to edit and mess up by subsequent editors. Anyways, So, you know, just having it, you know, where you have a single space between your equal sign and a single space between the value, for example, versus, yeah, here we have a single space, here we have a single space, but then we're trying to line up grog now, and we're using, you know, multiple spaces just to line up the equal sign there. And if you change the name of this, it's going to push this over. You know, if you change the value, it's going to push this differently. Like, it's just not good, right? Use a single empty line to express groups when useful, so don't start blocks with a blank line. I do see that a lot as well, where people will, you know, like they'll have an empty line between the start of their function and the actual code of their function. And then an empty line between the end of the code of their function and the actual end of the function. Like, just that's excessive. So one line statement per line, put function bodies on new lines. You know, so each function body should be on a new line rather than having it all on the same line. Like this. Obviously, this is a lot harder to read, right? Especially true of functions that return multiple values. So yeah, that's gross. So yeah, comparing this to this, this is a lot easier to read. Also true for if blocks. Ideally, don't put your if blocks in the same line. Now there is an inline if statement that you can do. So for example, if I did, you know, a variable here, we'll say local, we'll call local var, and then you can do like if A, then B, else C, right? So this is perfectly fine to do. This obviously doesn't end with end, because this is actually the way that you want to write out. If you're doing normal Lua, you would end up doing like A greater than, or sorry, A and B or C. This is the same exact thing as what I just wrote out. Tell me that this is more easy to understand than this. It's not. So Roblox themselves in Luau, they went ahead and implemented this change to what Lua is using, because it is just a lot more readable. It's a lot easier to see, a lot easier to understand anyways. All right, anyways, back up to here. So putting space before operators. So again, you know, just having, you know, clean space in here is just a lot easier to do. Now, obviously, I don't know who would do this, but yeah, doing an exponent of 2, you know, that should obviously always be together. But obviously, you know, putting spaces between your operators is really nice, and then putting a space after commas, so that you actually have that spaced out there, as opposed to everything being all close together. I don't know why you would do random spacing there. Creating blocks, so inline any opening syntax elements. So as you can see here, we're keeping the opening bracket here, and then we're hitting enter to space it out, and both Roblox Studio and VS Code will intelligently know to spread them out this way, versus, you know, doing things like this. Doing this is fine if you have a lot going on here, but typically you would actually put a space here, or a white space. You would hit enter here, and foo would be on its own line, and then is on the same line as if, and then you put the thing here, and then end is on the same line. I think that might even go and do that there. Avoid putting curly braces for tables on their own line, because it harms readability. So, you know, doing this sort of thing is like what a weird thing, especially if that gets, you know, a lot more values in it. It's a lot harder to read than what this is, as I mentioned. So an exception here, function calls with large inline tables or functions. It's sometimes more clear to put the braces on new lines. So for example, you know, having it like this versus having it like this is the only time it seems better. New lines and long expressions. So yeah, you know, basically kind of the same things we've been talking about here. Break list-like tables into multiple lines, however it makes sense. Make sure to follow the line length limit, right? So this is fine. You could also break this into this, and this is where as well it makes diffs cleaner, because again, a diff is going to show line by line. So if I remove test as from here, then in the diff it's going to show that line specifically, versus if I remove test as from here, it's going to show this whole line has been changed, and then you have to really dig down and be like, oh well, what is that? that was changed in there, right? You can group them if grouping has useful information. I do this in when I'm like creating weapons and classes and things that have like a lot of information in them. I'll kind of group things together so that they fit within the 100 line column limit, and then just go to a new line and place new things in there. It just keeps it a little cleaner. Otherwise, for long argument lists, nested tables, you want to expand all the subtables, right, so that they're a little better there. All right, so let's keep going. Let's go a little further down here. If statements, so this is what I was talking about, so you can break them down if you've got a lot of things in here, especially if they push out into that column limit that they want. Go ahead and break them into their own blocks within the if and the then and then the end. Just helps readability. I do this a lot. Otherwise, kind of doing that. And you want to start each line with the just the operator. So like the comparison operator, like we have and, or, not, that kind of stuff. Anyways, if then else expressions. So this is another thing I was talking about, is using if then else rather than this and or, which is from Lua. Safer, faster, more readable. It's safer because, so what this is basically, if this is true, then it's going to return this. If this is false, then it's going to return this, right, is what it's doing, which is what this is. However, if this value ends up being nil, and they've got it as 1 here, let's say it's a variable. If this value ends up being nil, if this is true and this is nil, then guess what? This whole statement is false, so it's going to return C when we actually still want to return nil. Whereas if this is the case, if some flag is true, then it's going to return, again, let's say that this is nil, it's going to return nil. So that's why it's safer. It's able to be used there. It even had, I think it goes into that here. Otherwise, let's go ahead and go down a little further to something else here. So blocks, don't use parentheses around the conditions. They aren't necessary in Lua, which you'll see a lot in like JavaScript and stuff, where they'll do the conditions in parentheses for whatever reason. Or not for whatever reason they have, obviously it's their syntax, but use double quotes when declaring string literals. So single quotes means we have to escape apostrophes. Awfully useful in English words, right? So empty strings are easier to identify with double quotes, because in some fonts 2 single quotes might look like a single double quote, right? Also, yeah, so you can see here we have to use the escape character, the backslash, to use that. And then if you're trying to put in a backslash, you have to also backslash. Single quotes are acceptable if you're containing something that contains double quotes. However, honestly, because Roblox has included in Lua that you can use backticks for a formatted string, just use backticks. Backticks allow you to use both apostrophes as single quotes and double quotes if you need to, so you don't have to do that. And then of course you can include your variables using a curly brace as well. Alright, so tables, avoid tables with both list-like and dictionary-like keys. I believe I talk about this in one of my videos as well. Highly silly to have mixed tables. They become, as I say here, troublesome. Iterate over list-like tables with iPairs and dictionary tables with pairs. You can do neither, and it will intelligently determine, the interpreter knows in Roblox or in Lua to use the proper iPairs or pairs based on whether it's an array or dictionary-like table. However, if you need to know, by looking at the code that it is an array or dictionary-like table, then use iPairs or pairs. I do go over that in my random selection script video, so you can check that one out. Trailing commas in multi-line tables. Definitely do this, but always put a trailing comma if you have multiple values. Anyways, so functions. Here's a good one here to keep the number of arguments to a given function call, preferably 1 or 2. So if you can do that, right? If you have a lot of them, one thing you can do is pass a table, and you can then access the table with arguments. Just make sure that you type out the table so type annotate the table so you know what kind of values you're expecting in the table if you're expecting different values. Otherwise, of course, you can use the 3 dots, an ellipsis essentially, to say that it's taken any number of arguments, but then obviously those number of arguments is going to be of any type, so it could accept any type of arguments. You want to be careful with that. Use parentheses when calling a function. Lua allows you to skip them in many cases. Lua allows you to skip them in many cases, but the results are typically harder to parse. Oh yeah, and then what it's saying there is basically, and I'm guilty of doing this as well, where you can, if you have your arguments in a table for your function, you can skip using the parentheses and you can just include it as a table directly, and it will work basically exactly the same. I'm guilty of doing that, but it is what it is. The last example using curly braces, yeah, that's what it's saying here for a function call. Common in other Lua code bases, but it's more readable using the feature that they're doing there. So declare named function using function prefix syntax. So saying local function and then your named function, as opposed to add equals function, right? Also making sure that it's local and not global, if you can, you know, as long as it's not a member function is what they're saying up here, which basically means it's not a member of a table, of a class, or something like that, right? So the exception here, late initializing functions and conditionals, etc. All right, so let's go down to comments. So wrap your comments 80 columns wide. Again, it's easier to read comments in shorter lines. Using single line comments for inline notes. If the comment spans multiple lines, use multiple single line comments. Sublime text has an automatic wrap feature if you use Sublime for your IDE. Otherwise, use block comments for documenting items. So use a block comment at the top of files and use block comments before functions or objects to describe their intent if they need to be in full block size comments. You can also, I would say, Moonwave style commenting is good as well, because it includes like parameters and return values and everything in your function, which can be typically pretty useful for a lot of things. Also makes just very clear what functions are doing and all that kind of stuff. If you're unfamiliar with Moonwave style comments, you can go ahead and Google that, you'll find out. Anyways, comments should focus on why code is written a certain way instead of what the code is doing. I'm guilty of putting what code does sometimes in my comments, and a lot of that is because I'm making tutorials, so I want to kind of, you know, describe what a code is doing. However, I also do like putting what code is doing so that in a lot of cases I can read the comment about, you know, especially in larger, more complex functions, I can read what the code, what that function is doing from the comment and not have to peruse line by line necessarily what that's doing. Now that only really counts when your variable or your function name isn't descriptive enough, right? If you can't use enough description in your function name to really state everything that function is doing, or, you know, the necessary things to know what that function is doing, then again, I would put what the function does in a comment. Otherwise, typically, if you are naming your function properly and naming it meaningfully, where it tells you what the function does, then you don't really have to put what the function is doing. And this is where, yeah, writing why the code exists is much better, right? No section comments. So comments that only exist to break up large files are code smell, and you probably need to find some way to make your file smaller instead of working around the problem with section comments. I sometimes like using section comments. It is a little easier. Sometimes you just can't make your code shorter or smaller or more easy to separate, so having section comments is fine. I'm not necessarily a fan of doing it this way. I actually like doing this kind of style here, because if I do you know, something like this, if I hover over this now, it's gonna go ahead and give me like a nice bold version of that, versus if it's just without that, it's gonna just be a smaller thing. So but I mean, in some cases, like, I'm not even using that as a section, right? So it's just kind of there to help break things up and tell me, oh, it's utility functions. But you know, then notice then I don't put like the class or the public functions or anything down here as a section. I could probably do that. Don't really know I did this. Again, I think it was just for demonstration purposes. Otherwise, so they talk about different ways to break up your code and stuff, and this is all useful information. Naming, so spell out words fully. Abbreviations generally make code easier to write, but harder to read. And again, that was one of the very first examples I showed there, using RS for replicated storage. Despite how common that is in Roblox scripting, don't do it. It's terrible. It's just bad code. And again, if you are also getting run service or anything else that has the abbreviation of RS, it makes it more difficult to then know exactly which one you're actually using there. Use Pascal case names for class and enum-like objects. Use it for all Roblox APIs, for your services. Use it also for file names. You want to use Pascal case where you can. And then camel case are deprecated, but they still work for now, but I wouldn't do that. Use camel case for your local variable names, member values, and functions. Acronyms within names don't capitalize the whole thing, so instead of capitalizing all of JSON, right, you would just use the first letter as J. HTTP, you would just use H as the capital letter and the TTPs there. So if you're doing like VFX, I see a lot of like underscore VFX. You can just use a capital V and then lowercase fx, and that works as well. Otherwise, the exception to this is when abbreviation represents a set, so like RGB, right? Versus RGB, red, green, blue, right? XYZ, these are actual abbreviations of red, green, blue versus an acronym, right? They're three different things. Loud snake case, I like calling this screaming snake case, for local constants. So basically if you're creating a constant, you want to use loud snake case. Private members should have an underscore, so anything that you typically want to know. Yeah, as it says here, Lua doesn't have visibility rules, so in things like C++, for example, if you create a private member using something like this, it's not even going to be visible to a public call. But in Lua, you can't make that not visible to your public calls, right? But you are still able to then see, oh, I'm not supposed to, actually use that or treat it like I can't actually see it. It just helps make it stand out, right? File's name should match the name of the object it exports. So if you're doing a module script for sure, and you have the module called you have the module's function, right, doing something, then the module name should be do something.lua. So try to name your module the same thing, right? We have foo_thing.lua, which is returning this foo threshold, or doing this foo threshold, but it's returning foo thing, so we're actually doing foo_thing.lua here. Yielding, this is a big one. Do not call yielding functions on the main task. Wrap them in coroutine.wrap or delay. It's coroutine.delay. And consider exposing a promise or promise-like async interface. I'm going to be going over promises in the future as well. Very useful. Something that sadly I have not used enough recently myself. For whatever reason, I've fallen away from that. And it's a bad habit to not use them. Good habit to use them. So Roblox's yielding model makes calling asynchronous tasks transparent to the user, lets users call complicated functions without understanding coroutines or other async primitives. But unintended yielding can cause hard to track data races. Simple code involving callbacks can cause confusing bugs if the input callback yields. So yeah, you definitely want to try to make that happen. Again, I'll go over promises and things so we can handle that in a later video. Error handling, when writing functions that call or that can fail, you want to have some sort of success result using a p-call or something. Use a result type or use async primitive that encodes failure like promises do. Do not throw errors except when validating correct usage of a function. So only using assert when basically if that's going to fail, then the whole thing should fail, right? Because that's going to then essentially act like a return and it's not gonna continue doing things. Versus you can do an error if it's like it's going to error out and it's going to return the error, but the rest of the code can still run or the rest of the script can still run, and that's fine. So using exceptions like unhandled errors bubble up automatically. Stack traces are automatically handled to error or attached errors. However, it can only throw strings as errors, which makes distinguishing them very difficult. So make sure that you're being clear about your actual error messages that you're creating, that you know what when you've included that per se. Exceptions are not encoded into a function's contract explicitly, so by returning a success result, you force your caller to consider whether an error will happen, which is always useful. An exception here, when calling functions to communicate failure by throwing, you want to wrap calls in a p call, and that's again going to have that success result come back. Anyways, general Roblox best practices: all services should be referenced using game get service, not game dot get or game dot service name. And when importing a module, use the name of the module for its variable name, right? Instead of creating a module called random selection and then just having it called random table or something, right? As its actual imported require. All right, so that is a lengthy discussion about the Roblox style guide, why you should use it. Make sure you pull this up, go through it, start to try to adhere to this. You'll notice that my code is all cleanly and consistently written because of that, or mostly anyways. And again, the closer you can adhere to this, the better. Even if you don't do every single thing specifically, make sure that you are calling out the most important parts at least. And again, staying consistent between you and your team is the most important aspect, so that everybody's on the same page. And that is that. So hopefully, this is kind of a long, boring one that didn't really have a lot of code in it. In the next video, though, I am going to be covering object-oriented programming with meta tables and things. So that one's going to be a big one. Make sure you subscribe, get the notify bell clicked so you know when that goes live. I do have my Discord server up and running finally again. It's been a couple years since I put that on hiatus for a bit. It is all fleshed out. Make sure that you join that. The link is in my channel. I will leave a link in the description as well to go ahead and join that. Come join in the fun. Cool thing about the Discord community is that not only do we have a place just to chat, we have specific chat for coding, we have specific chat for art, we have showcase section for coding and art, for gameplay, art, all that kind of stuff. And you can showcase what you're doing there. And then I also have a section specifically sectioned out to either find a team to help work on your stuff, to look for or offer work for commissions and things like that. And then if you just have general questions that you want to ask people in the community, you can ask them there. So that's going to be really useful. I'm trying to be as active as I can on there so that you can also ask me questions. Also, you'll get notifications there even when my YouTube videos go live, or if I can ever get back to streaming. That all depends on how much my newborn baby, well now he's a month old, lets me do some streaming. Finding time to do that, or even this, is kind of few and far between, but I'm doing my best. So until next time, have a good one.